All right.
Testing.
Okay, so it's 10 past 10 now. We're going to run the Q&A for 20 minutes and finish at 10:30, and we'll start the other session at 10 to 11. So we'll give you 20 minutes to talk to each other at the coffee break. I would just like to start off by saying that, to me, the whole Paris process is a bit like, imagine everybody in this room plus about another 70 people decide to go together out to a Chinese banquet, a really good, really expensive Chinese banquet. And when they're going, they each say how much they are personally going to pay for the food. And they go and they have the banquet, and then part the way through the meal, somebody puts up on a screen, okay, the cost of the banquet is this. This is how much people have pledged. And there's a gap. There's a gap between what everybody's offered and what needs to be paid. And then there needs to be a process whereby they agree between each other who's going to put how much more money on the table. And the transparency mechanisms, the global stocktake for the Paris Agreement is that process. So maybe that mischaracterizes it, but I would be very grateful if Professor Iki and Vicky, if you could comment very briefly on that. And after that, we will take questions from the floor. Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll just start off. I really like the way you put it. That's why I believe there is a better process, right? Instead of organizing this large Chinese banquet, I think the UN actually can play a better and smarter role, which is let's just set the target, and then we do a crowdsourcing, and from the very beginning, I think the UN is really the best organization to set a global target, to inspire all the parties, and then to lead from there. Then leave the countries, all the parties, government, business, citizens to play their roles and take their responsibilities and hold them accountable. I think that's exactly what we need to do. Look at the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals. That's what the UN-led effort, and also prior to that, the MDG, the Millennium Development Goals. UN is the best to do that. And there is no such organization like UNFCCC Secretariat to actually organize this annual conferences each year with tens of thousand people coming to this KATOWICE. I think UN can really now think about this. Exactly 1 month ago, I participated in the UN Secretary General, the executive meeting. Then I just made it very clear. I think this process does not work. Now, as much as like these noble goals and this great effort they have put in, and this process does not work. Let's think about a better way.
I agree. It's a good analogy. I think there's also a lot of work behind the scenes to. That means that certain parties have already saved or have put themselves on a diet, which means it's going to cost less in the long run. What I wanted to say also, I didn't respond to Chia's presentation where we were talking about the trajectories where different countries are, the business as usual, and how close they are to getting to their NDC targets. I think some of the research you presented is maybe a few years old because for example, for the EU, for the 2030 targets, we have a minus 40% 2030 target for greenhouse gases in the EU. We now have all the legislation in place, which means we will get there by 2030. In fact, the legislation we have in place, our projections put us at minus 45% in 2030. I think it's important to say because it's, in terms of the banquet, it means that some of us have already been putting the money aside to make sure we can get there. And so it makes it easier for the others, I think, maybe to stump up the rest. Also, just to say that China's also been doing its homework, and on the carbon market, while it's starting with the power sector, it's now, this year should go into a testing phase for power sector and full compliance trading next year for the power sector. The State Council legislation which announces the beginning of the ETS, it was issued last year, 19th of December 2017, was very clear that the power sector is the first sector, but the other sectors will come in. And all the work that's happening in mainland China on the ETS also includes those other sectors. So all the MRV guidance, all the work that's happening on the registry, everything is assuming that there will be the full 8 sectors will be in the ETS over time. Thanks.
So could I have a show of hands? 3. Right, okay, that's good. So we'll take the one there first. We'll take 3, if you can please keep your questions short. We'll take the 3 at the time.
Thank you. Thank you to the speakers who give us the warning that we may not be able to meet the target, and also the policy to execute and meet the target. Now, I have some observations which may be very helpful to meet the target, and I want to have some comment. The first one I want to know is there's a paradigm shift in the population in the world in the near, say, less than 20 years. Baby boomer will all disappear by that time, I believe. And some people predict that China population will be below 1 billion very soon in the next, say, 20 years. Now, and the other thing is, what changes the 5G bring to the world, which will help the world to reduce the energy consumption in car. With digitized running format, I can believe that this will be very helpful to the energy saving. And so the other thing I think the world can do more, in fact it's not enough at the moment, is to develop a global carbon emission reduction certification market, which I saw in the Kyoto Protocol period. And if we have this market, the policy can be nailed down to the ground with a very clear format of energy saving and encouragement of investment. So these 3 items, I believe, will be very helpful to meet the target in the world. Thank you very much.
Robert, firstly, thank you very much for your analogy. I'm going to fall into the trap and try and pursue where this might end. I suspect what happens is that all those who have traveled to the banquet will not come to an agreement. They will get back on their aeroplanes and they will fly home, and the bill will not be paid, and the bill will be left to be paid by future generations. And in a sense, in your analogy, they'll be having to deal with a bankrupt restaurant or a bankrupt ecosystem. So my question to the panelists is, how can we change the behaviors of today's leaders to better take into account the interests of future generations?
I noticed something at this meeting that I noticed at many other similar meetings, and that is that I believe there was not one single mention at a meeting on how to achieve carbon neutrality of the chief carbon neutral energy generation technology, namely nuclear energy. It seems to be something of a third rail of discussions, and this is one of the problems of large group meetings like this. You can get what's being described, you can get a certain groupthink where some topics are just unmentionable. It seems to be a third rail of discussion. But if this really is an urgent problem, and it very well might be, then it might require some thinking the unthinkable. And if you do that, there is a strategy that would achieve the goal, and that is to basically relax somewhat the safety standards of nuclear energy and risk the occasional Fukushima or Chernobyl, much as we've gotten used to risking the occasional commercial airline crash because we know that they're very rare. I wonder why there isn't more discussion of something like this if we really regard this as an urgent problem. It's a matter of trading off risks, balancing risks.
Thank you, Michael. So, 3 questions. On the nuclear, I believe the EU's plan is 80% renewable, 20% nuclear by 2050. But can I ask the panelists to respond to those three questions?
Okay, so starting maybe with the hardest one, the nuclear question, or the maybe more contentious one, the nuclear question. In the EU, different member states have different policies on nuclear. So at the EU level, we don't push nuclear, we work on nuclear safety and issues of how to deal with the waste. Our modelling assumes where nuclear will be, but we don't have, I think it's fair to say we don't see a big need to push new nuclear investments to make this happen. I think the assumption is much more about the role of that renewables will come in and we reduce the demand on the demand side through more efficiency and through better circular economy. And so I think the question is, I don't see that nuclear plays a massive role in the European Union. So I think for my response to that was, I'm not sure we really do need to take the risks. And those risks would not be acceptable in the EU. We could never win a debate where we go to people and say, let's relax nuclear safety standards. That's just, we're not talking about putting people's lives at risk to meet climate change commitments. We're talking about saving people's lives by meeting climate change. So I think we have to be really clear about that. In China, there is new investment in nuclear. It's maybe easier to get plants sited and built faster. But I understand there are also increasing questions about where to site plants because communities don't want nuclear. They want nuclear, but not next door. So I think that's a fact. And so there are many other technologies out there. And so whether your question, do we need to take the risk? I think in terms of transport, 10 days ago, not last weekend, the weekend before, there was a big EV100 forum in Beijing. That was really exciting. It's the second year I've been. I think it's the 5th forum. In China, car sales have been reducing, but EV sales have been going right up. And so there's a real, very rapid development in EV technology, which is also about connected cars. It's about a completely different way of seeing mobility. And there's some really exciting things happening in European companies, in Chinese companies, US companies, and it's not just the automobile manufacturers, it's many other companies coming in and developing these technologies. So it's also about integration with the grid, it's about cars as storage for renewable energy. In the Netherlands, they were looking at housing projects where they combine housing with PV on the roof with shared electric vehicles. Electric vehicles plug in and store energy at low demand times and feed the power back into the housing system at peak demand when they're plugged in. So some interesting new models coming up, and I think that's really exciting. And on demography, yes, there's a big question about aging population and whether our modelling assumptions are right. Will we all want to live in cities? Will the cities look the same as the population gets older? But I think also in countries where there is an aging population, I think there's also going to be new questions about immigration and people coming in to serve the aging population. So I'm not sure you just do away with, there are those changes. It's an issue we need to really work on in terms of how the assumptions we make when we do modelling for the future scenarios for 2050 in particular. Yes, in terms of getting leaders' attention, that's a difficult one because a lot of our leaders are of a much older generation, and I think having the youth voice at the COP was very important. But I think how do you get leaders to look at the voice of the younger generations and future generations? I see many examples around the world where they're not really doing that. I mean, I think we both come from the UK, so there's a question also there about intergenerational equity. Yeah, I think some of the younger leaders coming in are maybe more aware, and I think the pressure in Europe, at least, is getting much stronger. Even in Europe, where we see ourselves very much as leaders, there's a class action being raised against France, for example, for not doing enough. So I think there's rising pressure from society, and I think that will change over time. Whether it's fast enough, that's another question. Thanks.
Any quick responses?
Okay, I maybe first respond to Professor Michael's questions on the nuclear energy. Actually, in Hong Kong, is at the latest figure is about 25 to 30% is from nuclear, and others from coal and natural gas. And as I said in my presentation, we are try to say that natural gas is still have a carbon emission. We are going to check whatever that is any zero carbon emission, not just for the nuclear, but also other non-fossil fuel source. But we will try to figure out what is the, actually in Hong Kong it's quite limited energy source. You know, we are also promote the renewable energy, but seems in here we are trying to promote in all the residential or business buildings for the rooftop PV. And so we are working on this. And for the EV, we have a green transport fund for asking the public and also the NGOs to try out all the innovative ideas on the green transport in all the transportation means. And we are doing on that. We as maybe limit in Hong Kong is small pace, and so we are welcome on that. We are hoping on that. And so maybe from Professor.
A very quick response. Nuclear, have always been on the agenda. And if you recall, 2014, when China was planning for the joint announcement with the United States, we're talking about 100 to 150 gigawatts of additional nuclear. So now, of course, it's scaled down for two primary reasons. One is after Fukushima, and there is a review, a very thorough, complete review. Second, no need to have that much. And there is also very good reason economically, the real rapid development of wind and solar and have proved to be, could be a better option than nuclear, economically, financially. So the second dimension is the distribution risks, right? Nuclear, and there is a geographical distribution, and then there is an intergenerational distribution of risks. I think that's why I can't really go into that. For the how we're going to do with the pushing leaders. Leaders, by definition, they are there to change behavior of others, right? So it's really hard to push them. I'm pretty sure on that. We need to give them pressure and all kind of pressure. But the point I want to make here is, we should not just look at the leaders. We recognize the importance of a government and policy. There is it's capable responsibility for them. But on the other hand, I think the last 25, 30 years, we have been focusing too much on the government, too much on the leaders. And it looks like that's their responsibility to lead and to change this world. I think it is a time to look at all different sectors. Look at ourselves. We take a lead. We all take a lead. Then just real quickly about the carbon market. I like the idea of a carbon market. Theoretically, it's great. But so far, unfortunately, nobody, including the EU, has shown us this is actually working well. We still need to work to make them work better. But so far, while it's not working very well, we're making effort to improve it. I think we also do not just give up other means, the administrative measures like what China has been doing, and the carbon price, carbon tax, right? This is I think we cannot just focusing on the carbon market. Let's also thinking about the other means.
Thank you. Right, we're really out of time. Does a couple of people got really important questions they want to ask? Yep. One there. Anybody else? Okay, Magnus, very quickly, please.
I love Hong Kong. I think the government's great in many respects, but I'm appalled by the head in the sand, unawareness that we're on the Titanic. We're not thinking about boarding the Titanic. We're on the Titanic, and this talk about 1 meter sea rise is incredibly dangerous. We've got to model for much more serious 3 degrees. It's going to happen, Bring it on. It's a huge business opportunity globally. We mustn't be frightened of climate change, and we're frightened of it at the moment. We have to go on the offensive, not the defensive. So much of this stuff and these photo ops around the world are defensive. Let's go on the offensive and take on climate change, big it up, and let's create lots of jobs.
Thank you.
So it's a statement, not a question. But are you aware you're on the Titanic, Ivy, or is she aware she's on the Titanic? I don't think she is.
Okay, there's one other quick question, please.
One last question. Most of the conversation has been, and COP24 is also about the national level commitments, but all three speakers alluded to the fact that cities are among the largest consumers and also among the biggest leaders in terms of drastically reducing carbon emissions. So I'd like you to speak a little bit about the role of cities in particular in terms of solving this problem. Also in terms of governance, not just in terms of the numbers going down, but as a different form of governance.
So could each panelist do a very quick final comment responding to that and anything else they wish to say? Who would like to go first?
Well, I think last year, September, the Global Climate Action Summit in California highlighted that it is really cities, you know, right now, but 60% of population, 70% of energy consumption, 80% of carbon emission. There is no question about that. I think a lot of the cities now, they're taking too many responsibilities. Climate change is just one of them. I think we really need to change the priority of it. And the mayors in, well, I'm not sure about other places, the mayors in mainland China, you can ask them, they have a whole list of priorities. And climate change agenda tend to be quite invisible when you did look down to that list. I think there are lots of education work, training work to do to making sure the climate change agenda will be back on their agenda and making sure they actually address it. Right?
Yes, in short speech with 1 to 2 sentences, I would like to say that Hong Kong government is really aware on what the position or what a climate action is in Hong Kong. But so I would like to say in coming public engagement exercise, the documents that going to publish is for gather the public view on this and also education kit for the general public, because in some general public may not really have a really deep ideas what we're going to do, what the position in Hong Kong. So we also serve as an education kit. Yeah.
Just to say, we have very intense cooperation between cities in Europe and China. What I see in China, some of the cities are the size of nation states in other parts of the world. So of course, in certain parts of the world, those cities have a really big role to play. We really need to work with them to help them in their analysis and help them do the scenario work, sort of scenario work that we've done EU-wide for city level. And I think cities are particularly important because they're so close to the ground that they can really do the work, which is much more about integration, working across sectors, setting new visions, looking at very different ways of doing things. And so there's a lot of potential, but I think we probably need to even support them more and look at things, maybe approaches of how we can redistribute enough money to the cities to really get some of these exciting models through some of the funds we have. And for the finance to go to cities to help some of the more interesting cities develop really exciting examples of integration across waste management, transport, energy, bringing all these different thinking together, not keep them in separate parts of the government.
Can I just add 10 seconds? 10 years ago, I worked with the city of Baoding in China, and did that the very first low carbon city planning. And then we worked on several other cities, including the neighboring Hengqin in Zhuhai over there. Then when it comes to implementation, that's the problem. In the case of Baoding, as soon as the mayor left the place, then the plant is sitting there until a few years later we had another mayor who think this is important. Then he that's several years later, right?
Thank you very much. So we will break now and get back at 10 to 11. On the reception desk, there is this small piece of paper, environmentally friendly, which has a QR code. And on one side, it talks about the Climate and Adaptation Resilience Conference, which we had at UST at the end of October. And on the other side, it has the talk which Lord Stern gave to us at HSBC on the 9th of November. And so there's a QR code so you can get to it. And those events were both videoed. You can go and watch the videos and you can see some report on what was said. And we will do the same with this event. We are videoing this, we'll put it up. We'll be asking the speakers if we can have a version of their slides, which can also go on the website. So thank you. Thank you very much.